The following Appalachian Mountains horror story is real, disturbing, and should be used as a warning. The names and locations have been altered to protect the individuals involved. Viewer discretion is advised. At 5 a.m. on a Thursday in July, Emmett Carver was alone at a remote pond in Acadia National Park when a bear came sprinting out of the woods in a flat-out panic, followed seconds later by a 600-pound moose running for its life. Neither animal looked back. Neither animal looked at him. They were just running. The question that should disturb you is what they were running from. The sandwich was egg salad. That detail matters because it tells you everything you need to know about Emmett Carver's life. A 51-year-old man driving 4 hours north on a Wednesday morning in July, alone, with a foil-wrapped sandwich his 74-year-old mother made him sitting on the passenger seat of his '09 Ford F-150 like a co-pilot. No wife, no kids, no voicemails to return. Just a tackle box, 3 rods bungee-corded in the bed of the truck, and a thermos of black coffee wedged between his thigh and the center console. Emmett had been coming to Acadia National Park since he was a boy. Back then, his mother Ruth would drive him up from their house in rural Maine, drop him at the trailhead with a wave, and sit in the car reading paperback novels until he came back. She never hiked in. She never needed to. She understood, even when he was 9 years old, that Emmett didn't need company out there. He needed the opposite of company. Fishing wasn't a hobby for Emmett. It wasn't stress relief or a weekend activity. It was the only place in the world where his brain went quiet. And Witch Hole Pond, remote, mirror flat, tucked 40 minutes deep inside the park and surrounded by white pine and granite ledge, was the quietest place he had ever found. He pulled into the empty lot just before 5 a.m. No other vehicles, no other boot prints in the dirt. Perfect. The trail in was easy. 40 minutes, mostly flat, the kind of hike you could do in the dark, which is exactly what Emmett did. He knew every route and every turn. He had walked this path so many times that his feet knew it without being asked. He reached the pond just as the sky was shifting from black to the deep gray blue that comes right before sunrise. He sat up on his usual granite ledge, a flat slab that jutted out over the water like a natural dock, poured his coffee, and made his first cast. The surface of the pond was perfectly still. Not a ripple, not a sound. That's when he noticed the birds were gone. Not quiet, gone. Acadia at dawn is loud. Jays, thrushes, the constant territorial chatter of the woods waking up. Emmett had heard it 100 times. This was not that. This was the specific, heavy silence of a place where every living thing had already decided to be somewhere else. He told himself it was the heat front moving in. Weather does strange things to animals. He'd seen it before. He sipped his coffee. He watched the water. He made another cast. That's when his eyes dropped to the cattail edge along the far bank, maybe 30 feet across the water, and he stopped mid-sip. There was ice, a thin spiderweb skim of it laced through the cattail stalks like someone had pressed a freezer shelf against the waterline overnight. Delicate, real, in the middle of July. Emmett lowered his thermos slowly. He stood there for a long moment, looking at it. Then he looked up at the tree line, then back at the ice. The kind of man who fishes alone before sunrise is not the kind of man who panics. He is the kind of man who finds explanations. He found his coffee instead, but the ice didn't melt, and the birds didn't come back. Emmett walked over to the far bank. He told himself he was just stretching his legs. That's what he told himself. but his eyes were already fixed on that thin line of ice threading through the cattails before he'd even set his rod down. He crouched at the water's edge and pressed one finger against it. Solid. Real as January. He pulled his hand back and looked around the tree line the way a man does when he wants to make sure nobody just watched him do something embarrassing. The woods stared back. Nothing moved. He stood up, brushed off his knee, and made a decision the way Emmett always made decisions. Quietly, privately, and without a lot of drama. Spring vent. Cold water pushing up from underground, chilling the shallows. It happened. He'd read about it somewhere, or maybe Ruth had mentioned it once. Either way, it was a thing that existed in the natural world, which meant it had nothing to do with him, and he could go back to fishing. He went back to fishing. For 20 minutes, everything was fine. The sky finished turning pink and then blue. The pond stayed flat and still. Emmett worked his line methodically, the way he always did, patient, unhurried, his whole body settling into that particular calm that only came to him out here. Then he exhaled. A thick cloud of white breath rolled out in front of his face and hung there in the warm morning air. He stopped. He exhaled again, slowly this time, watching it. Same result. A full, visible breath cloud, the kind you get in November, not July. He held his hand up between himself and the tree line. The air on his palm felt fine, warm even. He turned his hand over. Fine. He breathed out again. The cloud came out toward the pond and dissolved. Emmett stood very still for a moment. His brain was already reaching for the spring vent again, stretching the explanation, trying to make it fit this new piece. Maybe the cold air was rising off the water in a specific column. Maybe he was standing directly above the vent somehow. Maybe. His eyes dropped to the tackle box on the granite beside him. The metal latches were glazed with frost. Not condensation. Not moisture from the water. Frost. The fine, feathery kind that forms on a freezer door left open overnight. Each tiny crystal perfectly defined, sitting on top of the metal like it had been painted there. He reached down and touched one latch with his thumbnail. It scraped off in a curl, like ice off a windshield. He straightened up and looked at his hands. His knuckles were white. Not grip white, cold white. He pressed his fingertips together and barely felt them. He pulled his phone from his shirt pocket and opened the weather app out of pure reflex, the way you check your watch even when you already know what time it is. 74 degrees Fahrenheit. Feels like 72. He read it twice. He put the phone back in his pocket and looked out at the pond. The water was still. The sky was blue. The sun was fully up now and hitting the granite ledge in a way that should have been warm on his face. His face was cold. Not wind cold, not shade cold. The specific deep cold of a room where something is wrong. The kind that gets into your back teeth and sits there. Emmett Carver was not a man given to imagination. He did not have a lot of use for things he couldn't see or measure. He had spent 51 years in rural Maine, which had a way of burning the dramatics out of a person early. So when his brain reached for a rational explanation and came back empty, not almost empty, not close, but completely, cleanly empty. That was the part that scared him. Not the frost, not the cold breath, not even the ice in July. The fact that he couldn't explain it. Whatever was out there had been close enough to frost his tackle box. And based on the temperature rolling off the pond right now, it was still close. It hadn't moved. Emmett reeled in his line. He didn't make a decision to stop fishing exactly. His hands just started doing it on their own, the way your body sometimes knows something before your brain catches up. He set the rod down on the granite and stood up straight and faced the tree line. 60 feet of open rock between him and the pines. The tree line was dark, the kind of dark that stays in deep woods, even after full sunrise, where the canopy is thick enough that the light never fully gets in. He stood there and looked at it for a long moment. Nothing, just shadow and vertical lines of trees. He reached down for his thermos. That's when the bear came out. It burst from the wood line to his left, not ambling, not foraging, not doing any of the things bears do when they're just being bears. It was sprinting, full speed, head dropped low, paws hammering the granite in a flat-out run. Emmett had seen bears his entire life. He had surprised them on trails, watched them flip rocks along creek beds, once sat completely still for 6 minutes while one investigated his campsite from 8 feet away. He had never seen one run like that. It crossed the open granite in under 4 seconds and disappeared into the tree line on the opposite side of the pond without once looking in his direction. Not a glance. Whatever was behind it was a significantly more urgent problem than the man standing on the rock. Emmett took 1 step back. He watched the tree line it had come from. Still nothing. No sound. No movement. Just that same deep, heavy silence that had been sitting on the pond since he arrived. 30 seconds passed. Then the moose came. A bull, easily 600 pounds, antlers thrown all the way back against his shoulders, hooves scattering loose gravel like buckshot. He exploded out of the same gap in the trees the bear had come from, and he did not slow down. He did not check his angles. He ran the way an animal runs, when slowing down is not an option it's willing to consider. He passed Emmett so close that the displaced air hit him in the face. 4 seconds and he was gone, crashing into the tree line on the far side, the sound of snapping branches fading fast into the distance. Then silence again. Complete, total silence. Emmett stood at the edge of the granite with his thermos in his hand and looked at the gap in the trees where both animals had come from. The brush wasn't still settling. No birds launched from the canopy. No secondary sounds of something large following them through. Nothing was chasing them. The woods they'd run from were completely empty. His mind went somewhere specific then. He didn't want it to, but it went anyway. The way your tongue finds a sore tooth even when you're trying to leave it alone. 12 years ago. Elk hunting up in the Boundary Mountains, light failing, picking his way back toward camp. Something moving through the tree line maybe 40 yards out. Walking upright. Too wide in the shoulders for a man and too tall for any man he'd ever met. Gone before he could get a clear look. He never told anyone except Ruth. He spent the better part of a decade convincing himself it was a hunter in heavy gear moving at a bad angle in bad light. He almost believed it. Almost. Standing here right now watching the exact spot where a bear and a moose had just run from in blind terror, that almost collapsed completely. Oh no, he thought. Not again. He almost smiled. Because at least that thing, whatever it was in the Boundary Mountains, had a name. People argued about it on the internet. There were blurry photographs. It was, in its own strange way, a known quantity, something you could survive. Then the cracking started. Not a branch snap, not footsteps. A deep structural groan, the sound a frozen lake makes in January when the ice shifts under its own weight. Once, from somewhere behind the near tree line, then again, from a different spot further left, then a third time, closer. Emmett's boot heel found the granite edge behind him. The sweat on the back of his neck went cold as tap water. Then one pine bough, a thick one 8 feet off the ground, bent slowly, steadily downward, like something enormous was leaning its weight against it from the other side. It held that way for 3 full seconds. Then it released. The shadow behind the tree line was the wrong shape. Not wrong like a bear standing up. Not wrong like a tall man in a heavy coat. Wrong in a way that had no file in his brain to match it to. And it was the wrong shape for a Bigfoot, too. Emmett's brain was still running the Bigfoot file. That small, stubborn part of him, the part that had spent 12 years half hoping, half dreading confirmation, was still pulling up the old memory. The Boundary Mountains, the wide shoulders, the upright walk. Maybe this is it. Maybe this is finally it. That thought lasted exactly as long as it took the thing to step out of the pines. It didn't crash out the way the bear had. It didn't announce itself with snapping branches or scattered gravel. It simply emerged, the way a ship materializes out of thick fog, unhurried, inevitable, as if it had been standing just behind the tree line for a very long time and had only now decided to stop pretending otherwise. Emmett's brain spent the first 3 seconds trying to call it something normal. A fallen birch tree catching the light wrong. A moose standing broadside in the shadows. A man, a very large man, in some kind of heavy gear. It was none of those things. It stood between 7 and 8 feet tall. Not the height of a tall person. Not even the height of a basketball player. The height of a standard doorway stacked directly on top of another standard doorway. That kind of tall. The kind of tall that looks fundamentally wrong in an open space because the human eye has no good reference point for it and keeps trying to find one. Its body was covered in hair, but calling it fur would be too generous, too animal, too normal a word for what Emmett was looking at. It was matted and dense and grayish white, packed so thoroughly with pine needles, strips of dark bark, and black forest dirt that it looked less like the coat of a living thing and more like the floor of the woods itself had simply decided to stand up and walk. Like the forest had been quietly assembling this shape for a very long time out of its own debris. The geometry of it was almost human. Shoulders, a neck, a head that turned, 2 arms that hung at its sides with a looseness that was somehow worse than if they'd been raised. It had the rough proportions of a person, and that almost rightness was the most deeply wrong thing about it. Because Bigfoot, in every account Emmett had ever half read on some late night falling down a rabbit hole, Bigfoot felt animal. Big and dark and animal. Something that belonged to the natural world even if it sat at the far edge of it. This did not feel animal. This did not feel like it belonged to the natural world at all. This felt older than the trees it had just walked out of. Older than the granite under Emmett's boots. Older than anything he had a word for. Then it turned its face toward him, and Emmett's thermos hit the rock. The face was the part he would never fully describe to anyone. Not because he couldn't remember it. Because some part of him understood, on a level below language, that putting it into words would mean looking at it again. The cheeks were sunken so deeply they threw shadows in full morning light. The skull beneath the skin was visible not like a sick person's skull, like a structural fact. Like the flesh was simply decorative, and the bone was what was actually there. The eyes were set so far back in the orbital sockets that they caught no light at all, appearing as 2 holes of absolute darkness in a pale, gaunt face. It exhaled, slowly, deliberately. No breath cloud came from its mouth. The cold was not coming from the air. The cold was coming from inside it, radiating outward the way a walk-in freezer hits you in the chest when someone swings the door open. The frost line on the granite ran from the tree line directly toward Emmett's feet like a drawn arrow. The air between them, 40 feet of open space, shimmered faintly. Not like heat rising off summer asphalt. The opposite. A cold mirage, the light bending around something that was actively pulling warmth out of the world around it. It did not growl. It did not take a step forward. It simply stood at the tree line and regarded him. That was the only word for it. The way a man looks at something small and trapped and entirely without options. Emmett did not run. His body stopped. Not from cold. From something that lived in a part of the human brain that existed long before language, long before fire, long before any of the things that made people feel safe. The part that exists for exactly this moment. The part that recognizes, without being told, when it is standing in front of something it was never built to survive. His fishing rod was still in his right hand. He had forgotten he was holding it. This was not the Bigfoot he had spent 12 years half hoping to find. That thing, whatever it was, had existed in the same world as him. This did not. Emmett's right foot moved first, not a decision, just a foot moving backward one step on its own. Then the left. His eyes stayed locked on the creature the entire time. It didn't follow. It didn't shift its weight or turn its head or give any indication that his leaving was something it needed to respond to. It simply stood at the tree line and watched him go with those two dark holes in its pale face. He turned his back to it once, just once, to navigate the granite path back toward the trail. That single moment, the 3 seconds his eyes were facing away from it, was the longest 3 seconds of his life. He walked, not running. He couldn't run yet. Running would make it real in a way he couldn't afford until he was somewhere with a locked door between himself and the woods. He walked at the pace of a man who is holding himself together through sheer stubbornness. Past the tackle box, past the rods, past his mother's egg salad sandwich still sitting in its foil on the granite. He left all of it. He didn't look back again until the park entrance sign was in his rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty. The woods on both sides were still. He exhaled for what felt like the first time in 20 minutes. The dashboard thermometer read 51 degrees. It had read 74 when he arrived. He watched it the entire 4 hours home, the way you watch a wound, waiting for it to do something. It never climbed back up. Ruth was on the porch when he pulled in just after 2 p.m., shelling beans into a colander the way she did every summer afternoon. She looked up. He was 4 hours early. He had no tackle box. He had no fish. He sat down in the chair next to hers, the one that had been his chair since he was 9, and was quiet for a long moment. "There was something up at the pond, Ma," he finally said. "Big, white, didn't move right." Ruth set down one bean. "Did it come at you?" "No." She picked the bean back up and kept shelling. "I'll make you a sandwich." Emmett sat there for the rest of the afternoon and stared at the tree line at the edge of their property. Not because he expected anything, just because he couldn't stop. Now, about what Emmett Carver actually saw that morning at Witch Hole Pond. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a trick of light and fear and a mind that had been alone in the woods too long. That's the easy answer. People take the easy answer all the time. But here's the thing. The Wabanaki people, the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, lived and hunted in that exact land for thousands of years before a single trail was ever cut through it. They knew those woods the way Emmett knows a fishing line. They built their entire understanding of winter and survival and death around that landscape. And they had a name for what Emmett described. They called it the Kiwakwa. And the way they spoke of it wasn't the way people speak of monsters. It was the way people speak of things that are simply, quietly, terrifyingly true. A being of impossible cold. A thing that does not chase. A thing that does not need to. A thing that simply waits at the edge of the world and watches you decide whether to come closer. Emmett Carver made the smartest decision of his 51 years that Wednesday morning in July. He walked away, and he didn't look back.